Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the University of Louisiana System's second weekly budget briefing webinar. My name is Jackie Tisdale. I'm the Communications Director for the University of Louisiana System, and I'll be moderating today's webinar, which is focused on tax credits. Before we get over to our speakers, just want to briefly go through a few logistics for the webinar. Again, we have 30 minutes of length, including the presentation and Q&A. All microphones are muted except for the speakers. You can use your question chat module to submit questions. That will only come to me. It will not be seen by any other attendees, and I will ask those questions to our panelists as much as time will allow after their presentation. You can control your panel for the webinar by clicking on the orange arrow that minimizes and maximizes your control panel. And just if this is your first webinar with us, sometimes that control panel automatically minimizes after a time. This webinar is being recorded. It will be archived and available at ulsystem.edu/budget, or you can go to our homepage and click on the budget icon at the bottom. Our panelists today are University of Louisiana System President, Dr. Sandra K. Woodley, University of Louisiana System Vice President of External Affairs, Rachel Kincaid, who handles she's our legislative liaison for the system, and UL System Vice President of Business and Finance, Dr. Edwin Lidoff. Now, before we turn it over to our speakers, we'd like to launch a quick poll, which I'm going to do now. You should see on your screen. Our question today is to gauge which of the existing tax credit or exemption program do you think yields the most money for the state? We'll keep that open for just a couple more minutes. And the answer to that question will be also in this presentation. Okay, 10 more seconds, if you can please make your selection. Okay, I'm going to close that poll. Poll is closed. You should see the results. 52%, the majority, believe that the inventory tax credits is the largest tax credit exemption program for the state, followed by the motion picture tax credits, then the horizontal drilling exemptions. At this time, I'd like to turn over the presentation to University of Louisiana System President, Dr. Sandra Woodley.
Thank you again. It's great to have you on our second webinar. We want to spend the time today going over a little bit more about the budgets and the potential fixes in the budget, particularly drill down a little bit deeper into the tax credit issue. I know that all of you have heard a lot about that in the press, and we want to take a few minutes to be able to talk a little bit more about that so you have a deeper understanding. But just a little debriefing again about the basics of what we talked about last time. The starting point for us in the budget history for the University of Louisiana higher ed system is that since 2009 to 2015, higher education has taken over a $700 million cut. Our system, the University of Louisiana system, is down almost $300 million in that period. That's the starting point before the executive budget that came out last week. It's also, I think, interesting to show the change in funds for our system over the same period of time. As we talked about last week, you can see from this chart and graph that the majority of our funds now come from tuition and fees rather than state funding, and that we're down a total of $90 million, even after all of the tuition and fee increases that have happened since 2009. And the unique challenges that come with a deeper reliance on tuition and fee revenue, I think, is known at all of the universities. We're worried about affordability, and we're also worried about having enough funding at the institutions to be able to maintain quality programs, and more importantly, to be able to increase access and enrollment and degree production so that Louisiana's economy can remain strong. So that's the backdrop from which we're talking about budget issues with you today. The next slide shows where we are. We talked last week about all of the different numbers that you've seen floating out in the papers around what are the budget cuts. And as we discussed last week, the bottom line is that the budget gap for higher education is $608 million unless some of the contingencies that were pointed out in the governor's budget actually do happen. And there's a myriad of those contingencies and different revenue plans that you will hear about between now and the end of the session. But we wanted to talk specifically today about the biggest one that the governor pointed out in his budget. In the governor's budget, he pointed out the contingency on tax rebates. He indicated that $372 million could go to alleviate this $608 million budget cut if they were able to roll back some of these tax rebates. So what we want to do today, what that means. And I'll now shift this to Rachel Kincaid, and she'll talk a little bit about the taxes and the credits.
Thank you, Dr. Woodley. So as the budget negotiations for higher education are beginning, there's been a lot of discussion about a variety of taxes and credits. And so what we want to do is just share some background with each of you about some of those taxes and credits that may be considered in the session and what higher ed needs to know about them. So just in general, the State Business Tax Climate Index, Louisiana in general ranks 35th overall, 23rd in corporate tax rank, 27th in individual income tax, and then 50th in sales tax. So our sales tax for Louisiana, and as a higher education institution, all of higher ed in the state is very vulnerable to fluctuations in the budget for the state, either reductions or increases, because it's not the higher ed is not constitutionally protected. So what we wanted to do on this slide is really point out where the majority of the revenue for the state comes with respect to taxes. And so 57% of it is from sales and personal income tax. There's been a lot of discussion about some of the mineral revenues, and that makes up 10%. You see gaming is 8%. Gasoline and diesel 6%, corporate income and franchise taxes are 3%, insurance taxes are 5%, and then 2% on the excise taxes, which are essentially alcohol, beer, and tobacco. A little background on Louisiana's tax sources. And so this graph shows, you'll see very clearly there's been a dip in the revenues from sales taxes. So from 2008 to 2010, sales taxes, personal income taxes, corporate income and franchise taxes, and mineral revenues, which account for 70% of all the taxes, declined. Taxes, license, and fees declined from just over $12 billion in fiscal 2008 to $9 billion in 2010, or 25%. So again, as an unprotected portion of the state budget, higher education is particularly affected by any shifts in the tax receipts. On Tuesday, the House Education and House Committee on Ways and Means and the Senate Committee on Revenue and Fiscal Affairs met to receive a study commissioned by Speaker Cleckley in 2014. The study was conducted by professors from the University of LSU University and Tulane University. Dr. Richardson in particular is also on the Revenue Estimating Conference. And so essentially what they did in their study is to review Louisiana's tax structure and how it compares with other states, and look at those things that perhaps could create a better stability for the state moving forward, not just this year, but for years to come, as long as 10 years. So one of the things they noted was that exemptions, exclusions, credits, and the rebates have increased about 10% on average. And so in 2010 it was $7 billion, and in 2014 it's projected to be $7.7 billion. They also mentioned the refundable credits, which are part of the inventory tax credit, is also a refundable credit, which now totals $777 million, which is up considerably just a couple of years ago. So on the study that they did in the Louisiana tax study findings, they specifically talked about a broad category of different tax rebates and credits. So on the next page, you'll see just kind of a listing of where those are. The one that the governor put in his executive budget is the inventory tax credit, is at $458 million. The motion picture is $250 million. The horizontal drilling exemptions are at $240 million. Wind and solar is at $63 million. The enterprise zone is at $61 million, and then the quality jobs program is at $44 million. The tax study recommendations are to take a look at all of these exemptions, actually to look at all the exemptions across the budget, but to particularly look at these individually and either scale them back or completely eliminate them. So there were a variety of recommendations in the report, but each one of these was recommended to kind of have a reduction of at least some in this first year. So the other thing that the report also mentioned was a review of the excise taxes. And what you may see is several cigarette tax or tobacco tax increases. And so what we've done here is compared Louisiana with the national average in the southern states, which is embedded in the report. The excise taxes contribute significantly to the state budget, or $825 million. Of that, the Louisiana liquor excise tax is below the average, with the lowest in the United States. The cigarette tax is 36 cents, with the average in Texas, Arkansas, and Mississippi is $1.08. And the average in Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee is 53 cents. Louisiana is 48th in the country in the terms of tobacco tax, and they suggested a review of that. They also suggested a review of also the tax on wine, which happens to be in the lowest in the country. So they suggested a review of that as well. So on the next page, overall, their general recommendations were to take a look at all the existing exemptions and to really take a look at those and see if we needed the same number of exemptions that are in there. The majority of the exemptions are specifically in the first 7 that we had in the slide previously. But they requested that they take a look at all the exemptions in the state. Rebates, taxes, and exemptions actually account for 70% of all of the tax revenue for the state. So the majority of the tax revenue in the state is actually rebated. So they recommended a reevaluation of that, as well as a moratorium on any new ones, a sunset on the other tax exemptions. Most of those that are in the current state constitution do not have sunsets, and it's suggested that to be even more alignment with other states, we should do that. They also recommended a removal of the sales tax holiday.
Can I explain what sunset is for those who aren't
familiar? Sure. So for sunset, essentially most of the tax credits and rebates that are in Louisiana's constitution or are currently on the books do not have any principle where they sunset after 5 years or sunset after 3 years, where you reevaluate whether that credit is actually creating the economic development goals or meeting those goals, or whether you want to continue it, or also capping it. Several of the tax exemptions have no cap, so it's very hard to predict in the state budget what those levels will be. And certainly, as higher education is not a protected fund, any fluctuations in that make it very vulnerable.
So a sunset provision would make it automatically expire unless the legislature does something else, rather than keeping it on indefinitely with no review.
So the other thing, the next slide, there's been a couple of bills that have been filed since the tax study on Tuesday. One is House Bill 77 by Representative Ritchie, and it would have increased the cigarette tax to $1.18. This would be a constitutional amendment on the ballot in October. And at that level, there was a fiscal note that was actually put together last year, was essentially the calculation of what that would bring to the state with respect to tax receipts. As you increase the tax, there is a drop-off. So they predict that essentially in the first year would probably be around $142 million, with $252 million in new tax receipts in the years following. House Bill 89, also by Representative Ritchie, would reduce the amount of the inventory tax credit to 75%, effective in 2015. That essentially would bring $100 million in new revenues to the state. So that is very different from what the governor proposed, but is also one of probably many proposals that would be put on the table. We expect to see a lot more legislation around all of these credits and taxes. Perhaps the tobacco tax is the only one that might be an actual tax. Mostly it will revolve around the refundable credits or the credits in general. So just to recap, we have $1.1 billion in tax credits and exemptions. We've listed those that are the largest and were pointed out in the report. And then our gap for higher education is $608 million. So we're going to be continuing to watching this legislation, and we'll continue to update everyone on the legislation as it moves forward. Some will require a constitutional amendment. Some could be a simple suspension. So with that, Dr. Woodley, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think just a little bit of a review, just to kind of go back over the major points. I think, as we talked about before, the gap for us is $608 million. According to the governor's proposal, $372 million of that could accrue to higher education. That would still leave us with a pretty sizable gap. And so the idea that there are multiple avenues for us to be able to make ourselves whole over the session is going to be an uphill battle. And as the pictures denote, there are a lot of constituencies for each one of these tax credits and exemptions. These are funds that fund these other entities, whether they're local entities or other small businesses. And as we said in our last discussion, it's not our intention in higher education to be against business and industry. The opposite is true. We think we need to support business and industry, and we're hopeful that business and industry will support higher education. But yet we still have an issue that we have the $608 million budget gap that we have to have some way to alleviate. So what will happen over the next several months as these bills materialize and as plans come together, we'll be looking for a way to support whatever plan whatever thoughtful plan is out there that can help us get the $608 million restored back to the higher education budgets so that we can continue our pathway to increase our degree production, particularly in the high demand fields, to protect Louisiana's economy. And with that, Jackie, I think we can take some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Woodley. We have 4 questions submitted so far. I want to remind the audience to please use your question chat window to submit additional questions. Our first question is, what happens if the governor's proposal to direct inventory rebates to higher education is unsuccessful?
Well, again, that's one of the challenges that we have, and the reason that it's important to have multiple options on the table at any given time. There will be multiple bills to increase tax revenue. There will be multiple bills to look at the credits and exemptions. There will be multiple bills to look at autonomies that may be useful for future flexibility in higher education. And I think we have to continue to look for solutions, even as some of these may become less popular or gain less or more speed during the session, so that we have multiple vehicles in place so that we can find a pathway by the end of the session. Any one of these proposals could meet with enough opposition that it at some point could become impossible to pass the legislature. So we have to have multiple things on the table to find our relief. Rachel, anything to add there?
Next question, Jackie.
Okay. The next question is, when would we know all of the different proposals that are being filed?
So a lot of proposals are being filed now. The committee members are looking at the study, evaluating that. Members are talking with each other and meeting. We've already seen 2 bills that have been filed. Bills can continue to be filed depending on the number of bills that an individual legislator has already filed. They have a quota of 5. So, but if they have not met that, or if it's different bills are actually coded in different ways, so for the most part, you can continue to file bills until April 3rd.
So we should know soon, at least all of the pieces that are on the table for us to work during the session.
Our third question is, would revenue from the proposed tax changes be available this year to higher education, or fiscal year 16?
Yeah, so the revenue from some of these changes, depending on which one actually would be available this year, the cigarette tax is one that's been mentioned a lot. The first year would have declined revenues of, say, $142 million the first year, but $252 the following year. There's a variety of reasons for that. On the credits and the refundable, some of that would be immediate, but it also depends on the time that's put in the bill. Is it effective January 1? And it also affects, what are those things that have already been paid? What are those credits that have already been renewed? So it depends on a variety of factors, but each of these proposals will have an estimate on how much revenue it would bring in this year, as well as the years to come.
Okay, have a couple additional questions that aren't directly related to this topic, but the first one is, when might we see a fiscal note on Carmody's bill to consolidate management boards?
They're actually working on that right now. We've already received a request for that. And actually, that's been proposed before, so it probably won't take very long to do that. So I expect that would be available on the Louisiana Legislature website, early next week.
Our next question is, the governor seems to see privatization as positive, progressive move to dealing with budgetary challenges. What do you think that this could possibly look like in higher education?
Well, there's certainly a growing debate about privatization, and then that means different things to different people. From a Louisiana perspective, I think having some additional autonomies and flexibility could be very important to our institutions, because as you saw from our earlier chart, most of the funding for higher education does not come from the state. Most of the funding for higher education comes from the student. In a sense, it already is private. But the other challenge, of course, is that, the economic definition of a public good, which I think higher education is that if you totally privatize higher education, not enough of it will be produced, because people simply can't afford to pay the full bill. And I think that's especially true in Louisiana. We're seeing challenges on enrollment already now for institutions who have increased tuition pretty significantly over the past 8 years, and we're getting to a point where the people in Louisiana, many of them, can no longer afford to pay the bill. So you can imagine if the state totally got out of the higher education business, then only the relatively wealthy people in Louisiana and their children would be those that could benefit from higher education. Now, the problem for that in Louisiana is, as we know from our work last session, is we have a growing demand, an increasingly growing demand for college and university graduates for the workforce that's here now. We can't meet the demand. We don't have enough resources to hire the faculty, to ramp up production, and to give the access to students so that they can actually get a degree and go and fill these jobs. So the long and the short of it is, I believe, my own personal view is, total privatization would set Louisiana back. Louisiana, in my view, has to invest state funds in higher education, or not enough of our population will be able to participate, and our entire economy will begin to slide backwards. And we could lose the progress that we've gained in economic development over the past several years. So I think in one sense we're already mostly privatized, but we need to start having some reinvestment from the state into higher education so that we can meet our long-term goals system-wide, statewide, for economic development in Louisiana.
All right, our next question, is there any interest in dedicating lottery proceeds to higher education?
Most of what there is a bill to actually devote some of the funding that might come from the economic damages from the BP oil spill to a dedicated fund for higher education. There are some funds that are dedicated for higher ed with respect to TOPS, but there's been no discussion yet to do anything other than perhaps the BP oil spill funding, the economic damages from that, and establishing a trust fund with that.
We have time for 2 more questions. Can you speak a bit more about tuition fee increase proposals and swap out of funds?
Yes, the concern we have, so there are a lot of different things about tuition and fee that you'll see in the session rolling in. I think it's easy to get confused on what pieces could be helpful and what pieces may not be as helpful. From our perspective, we want to make sure that we minimize any additional burden on students. And so any additional autonomy that the systems get on tuition and fees will be used very responsibly. And for the most part, for our system, it's really a long-term flexibility that could be important in our ability to be able to manage our institutions as state funds fluctuate. But I think it is also true that looking at the autonomies, as I said earlier, could be an important step. Making sure that we minimize the burden on the student is something that we really are going to have to do. It's a kind of a confusing concept of why higher education would request more tuition and fee autonomy and then worry about affordability. I think both of those things are true simultaneously, and we have to find a way to keep our affordability intact while we have the flexibility to manage our operations.
And maybe I can kind of explain how the tuition swap actually works. So our tuition might be about $7,000, and with the GRAD Act legislation, we can increase tuition 10%. And in order to increase tuition, you have to have a 2/3 vote of the legislature. So the GRAD Act was passed by 2/3 vote of the legislature. So if tuition is $7,000 and we can go up 10%, the tuition next year would be $7,700. Well, what's happened is that $700 for, if you had 10,000 students, that amount of money that you generated in additional tuition, the general fund dollars from the state was backed out. So this year, they've taken $70 million of the tuition swap out of the general fund for the institutions. And one of our concerns is that we're not going to generate $70 million in tuition because enrollments are going down. I think we've reached that point to where some institutions don't have the capacity to increase 10%. Also, our tuition is adjusted to the SREB average, and a number of institutions are close to or at the SREB average and won't be able to go up 10%.
Yes, and so part of our ask for the $608 million is just that. We don't want a tuition swap. We want any increases that the tuition that the students give to the university to go back into the quality of their programs and the services that they receive, and not to go back to the state budget. And so we're advocating to the legislature that we eliminate the practice of swapping tuition for a budget cut and find a way, as I said earlier, to start to invest in higher education and allow those tuition dollars to go back into the classroom.
I'm going to like to merge the last two questions together since we are getting to the close of time. Do the majority of legislators really consider higher education funding a crisis? And what can the public and those who support higher education do to advocate for full funding?
I think we are hearing widely that our friends in the legislature and in the governor's office do feel that this is a crisis, and I think everyone is looking for a solution. Getting to the solution is going to be difficult politically, and it has a lot of moving parts and a lot of constituencies in areas other than higher education that can make it very treacherous as we go through the legislative session. But I do feel that our legislature and the administration understand that we need to fill this gap, and not just for higher education, but for Louisiana. I think what you all can do is to continue to track this progress and get messages out to your stakeholders that you know, and help us to reiterate that we have to find a solution for the full $608 million. We need to find a way not to go backwards at all to be able to deliver on the promises that we would like to do for Louisiana. And I'll repeat something that I said in an earlier webcast. I think it is important to recognize that the legislature does want to find a way to help. And it's important to be respectful in our dialogue, both with legislators and beyond, because I think everyone's looking for a solution. We may disagree on how that may roll in or what the different pieces are, but I think that there is wide support for trying to close the gap. We need to be able to have positive messages and very specific messages about your own particular university and the damage that it would happen if these cuts did roll in. But we do appreciate a positive, respectful message.
Thank you, Dr. Woodley, Rachel, and Dr. Lidoff. That concludes our presentation. Would like everyone to know that this is being recorded. The presentation and the recording will be posted on our budget website. And next Friday's focus will be on mergers and closures, dispelling lots of myths that are out there about whether that would actually realize any savings for the state. So again, we will send reminders about that. We would like you to, have to register each time for these webinars, but they will be every Friday at 11:30 a.m. Thank you to everyone. Have a great weekend.